From the outside, their lives looked like something pulled straight out of an aspirational magazine spread. Catherine was the kind of woman whose name carried weight in the business world. She had built her reputation on discipline, shrewd decision-making, and an ability to turn even fragile ideas into lasting enterprises. Her husband, Daniel, carried his own charisma, polished, charming, and often described by colleagues as the perfect complement to Catherine's strategic brilliance. Together, they appeared to be more than a married couple. They were a brand. The company they co-founded, a mid-sized but rapidly expanding consultancy, had become the envy of their peers. Its offices, housed in a sleek, glass-fronted building downtown, symbolized progress and authority. To the employees who filled its corridors, Catherine and Daniel embodied stability. Their presence reassured investors, attracted new clients, and inspired staff to dream bigger than their job description suggested. They were not just employers, they were role models, proof that partnership in love and business could coexist in harmony. But what few knew was that Catherine had not walked this path alone. Long before the glossy veneer of success, she had relied heavily on her business partner, Melissa. The two women had been friends for over a decade, bonded by a shared ambition and complementary skill sets. Catherine was the strategist, while Melissa had the uncanny knack for relationship building, the kind of talent that secured deals others would consider impossible. Together, they had transformed a struggling startup into a competitive force. Melissa wasn't just another face at the office. She was family in every sense of the word Catherine could allow herself outside of blood. The holidays spent together, the celebrations of milestones, the laughter over late-night wine after grueling work days, these were the moments that cemented trust. It was Melissa who Catherine turned to when Daniel hesitated over big decisions. It was Melissa who reassured Catherine that their empire would stand tall, no matter the storms ahead. And Daniel? He seemed to respect that bond. Early on, he had understood that Melissa was integral to Catherine's world. He played his part with the same charm he reserved for clients. Warm compliments, polite banter, and gestures of appreciation. To Catherine, it felt like balance. To the employees, it looked like perfection. The trio became the beating heart of the company, setting its pace, dictating its culture, and drawing everyone else into their rhythm. Their empire grew rapidly. New offices opened in neighboring cities. High-profile clients signed contracts that once seemed unattainable. Awards for leadership and innovation found their way onto their shelves. The press often photographed Catherine and Daniel side by side at galas, Melissa never far behind. The image was consistent, carefully curated, and dazzling. The wife, the husband, and the friend who made it all happen. Yet perfection has a way of concealing fractures. Behind the magazine covers and boardroom victories, shadows lingered in places Catherine rarely looked. She was so deeply invested in building, in pushing forward, that she often ignored the quiet strains that crept in during the late hours. Daniel's absences she explained away as workload. Melissa's exhaustion she chalked up to dedication. She believed in the strength of the ties that bound them, so much so that she didn't notice when those ties began to twist into something else. Catherine's sense of pride in their accomplishments blinded her to the subtle cues. She had trained herself to see challenges as obstacles to overcome, not warnings of deeper trouble. The empire they had created was too polished, too admired, too untouchable for her to imagine betrayal hiding within its walls. The three of them had weathered setbacks before. Tough clients, shifting markets, financial scares, and each time their bond had only seemed to grow stronger. Why would this be any different? The employees, too, believed in the image. They whispered about Catherine's drive, admired Daniel's charm, and sought Melissa's mentorship. In hushed tones, they called them the untouchables, leaders whose unity seemed beyond the reach of ordinary problems. Loyalty to the trio became loyalty to the company. Few dared question their choices, and even fewer imagined that the foundations might not be as unshakable as they appeared. On evenings when Catherine walked through the quiet office after most had gone home, she sometimes paused by the framed photographs on the walls, the three of them shaking hands with partners, smiling at ribbon cuttings, celebrating awards. The pictures told a story of trust, progress, and unwavering unity. Catherine believed in that story with every fiber of her being. She had to. It was the story she had written, the one she had invested her life into, the one that gave meaning to the sacrifices she had made. What she didn't realize was that stories, even the ones we build ourselves, can have secret chapters. And hers was already being written, quietly, discreetly, in corners of her empire she never thought to question. The office was a living organism, buzzing with conversations, the clacking of keyboards, and the rhythm of ambition. To an outsider, it looked seamless, each employee moving with purpose under the guidance of Catherine, Daniel, and Melissa. But within any close-knit workplace, rumors cling like shadows, surfacing in quiet corners and whispered exchanges. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then the whispers began to find their shape. It started small. A few employees noticed Daniel spending longer stretches of time in Melissa's office. The door closed under the pretense of strategic discussions. That wasn't out of character in itself. The two often collaborated on client relations. But the tone of their interactions had shifted. Where once there had been a professional crispness, there was now laughter that carried too easily through thin walls, or silences that lingered longer than seemed necessary. The kind of pauses people read into, even if they couldn't name why. Catherine, absorbed in leading expansion negotiations, initially brushed off these observations. She told herself she was reading too much into coincidences, a late-night call here, a knowing glance there. After all, the three of them had worked side by side for years, blurring the lines between professional and personal trust. Why should she doubt them now? Still, her instincts, that inner compass that had guided her to business triumphs, began to twitch uncomfortably. Daniel had developed new habits. He stepped outside the office more frequently to take phone calls, lowering his voice, offering vague explanations. When Catherine asked, he claimed it was clients needing immediate attention, deals that couldn't wait. He became oddly defensive, brushing her off with a smile too practiced to feel natural. She wanted to believe him, and often did, but the pattern gnawed at her. Melissa, too, seemed changed. Once open and transparent with Catherine, she now carried an edge of secrecy. She was still competent, still the same charming, persuasive presence in front of clients. But with Catherine, there were gaps. She evaded small questions, skipped casual lunches they once shared religiously, and claimed exhaustion when Catherine suggested their evening wine talks. To anyone else, Melissa looked as dedicated as ever. But Catherine, who had known her for over a decade, sensed the difference. The employees noticed as well. They spoke in hushed tones by the coffee machine or in hallways when they thought no one was listening. "Have you seen how often Daniel's in Melissa's office?" one whispered. "It's like they're glued together." Another chimed in, "Catherine must know. She always knows." But their voices carried hesitation, because Catherine's presence demanded respect. Few dared bring speculation directly to her, afraid it would be seen as disloyalty or gossip. Catherine began to feel the tension without anyone uttering a word. When she entered a room, conversations sometimes stuttered to a halt. Eyes flickered between her and the other two leaders, then quickly away. She recognized the unease. It was the kind of behavior she'd once observed in competitor companies on the brink of collapse. Except this wasn't about profits or clients. It was personal, and it was bleeding into the professional, whether she liked it or not. Her nights grew restless. She replayed moments in her mind. The time Daniel returned home later than expected. The nervous glance Melissa had given when Catherine casually asked about a canceled business dinner. She told herself she was imagining things, but the narrative wouldn't quiet. In the silence of her bedroom, with Daniel already asleep beside her, Catherine's mind would spiral, questioning everything she thought she knew about loyalty. The unease spread beyond her private suspicions. She noticed inconsistencies in reports, unexplained expenses in the company account, and discrepancies in travel schedules. Daniel claimed he had been meeting potential clients, but the follow-up materials were thin. Melissa mentioned attending industry mixers, but Catherine couldn't find evidence of the contacts she supposedly met. None of it was blatant, but the lack of clarity pricked at her like splinters beneath the skin. Still, Catherine's pride kept her silent. She wasn't the type to chase shadows or indulge in baseless accusations. To confront them without proof would mean undermining her own authority, both as a wife and as a leader. So she played the role of the composed executive, guiding the company forward, while privately second-guessing the very pillars holding it up. The whispers in the office did not stop. They grew, taking on sharper edges as employees noticed more. When Daniel and Melissa shared a joke in the break room, a junior associate caught the exchange and later told a colleague, "That wasn't just business talk." Another swore they saw the two leaving the office together after hours. The rumors weren't shouted. They slithered quietly, but they moved fast enough that Catherine could feel their weight in the atmosphere. For Catherine, every laugh, every sideways glance, every unexplained late night became another thread in a web she hadn't consented to spin. She was trapped in the uncertainty, unwilling to believe, yet unable to ignore. Her trust in both Daniel and Melissa was the bedrock of her personal and professional life. If that cracked, the entire empire might crumble. And so the whispers continued, invisible but suffocating. Catherine carried herself as the strong, unflappable leader she had always been. But beneath the calm surface, doubt had begun to take root, and with it came a slow-burning dread she could no longer dismiss as paranoia. The human mind has a way of silencing what it doesn't want to confront. Catherine had tried that for weeks, rationalizing, dismissing, explaining away her husband's behavior and her partner's distance. But denial has its limits. Eventually, the cracks in the facade grew too wide to ignore. It was in the small details that truth began to announce itself. Catherine was meticulous by nature, trained to notice what others missed. One evening, while reviewing expense reports, she noticed duplicate charges for hotel rooms in cities where only one executive had supposedly traveled. At first, she thought it was a clerical mistake, but as she dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Daniel and Melissa often happened to be in the same places, though their official schedules listed different purposes. Business dinners that appeared nowhere on the company calendar. Taxi receipts paid within minutes of each other. Flights booked to the same destinations under unrelated pretexts. She tried to convince herself these coincidences were part of legitimate work, but the evidence refused to bend to her will, and once she allowed herself to truly look, the signs multiplied. Catherine remembered a late-night return from a client dinner. When she entered the office to grab some forgotten files, she had seen Daniel standing in Melissa's office. The door was ajar. Their conversation halted the moment she appeared, both of them startled like children caught with hands in the cookie jar. Melissa had laughed too quickly, explaining something about last-minute client prep. Daniel's smile had been thin, strained, and Catherine had swallowed the explanation, though unease twisted in her gut. Then came the messages. Catherine wasn't one to pry into personal devices. Her dignity had always prevented her from crossing that line. But Daniel had grown careless. His phone lit up one evening while he showered, a preview of a message flashing across the screen. Catherine didn't touch it, but the fragment she saw was enough. A tone far too familiar. Words that belonged between lovers, not colleagues. She never confronted him that night, though the image of those words seared into her mind. Her instincts sharpened into vigilance. She began noticing the way Daniel and Melissa's eyes lingered when they thought no one was watching. A hand brushing against an arm longer than politeness demanded. A laugh that sounded private, as though it excluded the rest of the world. To an employee, these might have looked like harmless camaraderie. To Catherine, they screamed of intimacy. What unsettled her most was how their betrayal invaded spaces she had once considered sacred. Melissa had been in Catherine's home countless times, sharing meals, birthdays, and quiet nights filled with trust. She had once poured out her fears to Melissa over a bottle of wine, seeking reassurance that Daniel was the partner she could rely on. Now the irony cut deep. The very person she had trusted to steady her life was entangled in unraveling it. Her role as leader forced her into cruel composure. In boardrooms, Catherine delivered flawless presentations, negotiated deals, and smiled for photographs. But behind closed doors, she became a detective in her own marriage and business. Every email, every calendar entry, every odd silence became evidence to catalog. She began cross-checking itineraries, replaying conversations, recalling moments when she had ignored her instincts. The puzzle was gruesome, but with each piece the picture grew sharper. Still, Catherine hesitated. Evidence was not the same as certainty, and certainty was dangerous. To accuse without proof would risk everything: her marriage, her company, her reputation. She had built her life on decisiveness, but this decision carried the weight of her entire existence. One false move could shatter it all. Her nights became a tug of war between grief and restraint. She would lie beside Daniel, watching the rise and fall of his chest, wondering how long he had been lying not just beside her, but to her. She thought of Melissa, whose friendship had once been her anchor, now transformed into a shadow she could no longer trust. The betrayal was not yet spoken, but it lived inside her, pressing against her ribs with every breath. Meanwhile, the office atmosphere thickened. Employees grew bolder in their silence, their avoidance louder than words. Catherine noticed how conversations shifted when she entered the room, how eyes darted nervously toward Daniel and Melissa. The whispers she had once dismissed now took on the shape of confirmation. The secret wasn't hers alone anymore. It lived in the walls of the company, humming like an invisible current. Catherine understood what this meant. Betrayal, once private, had begun to spill into the public domain, and soon there would be no containing it. She could no longer afford to dismiss the signs as paranoia. What she feared was real, and it was unfolding before her in plain sight. The empire she had built, the polished glass offices, the award-winning reputation, the illusion of a power couple leading with unity, was rotting from within. And though she had yet to expose the truth, Catherine knew the moment of reckoning was approaching. All that remained was to decide whether she would confront it on her terms or let it devour her in silence. Catherine had always believed the worst betrayals weren't loud. They were quiet, creeping into one's life like a shadow that only revealed itself when it was too late. For weeks, she had balanced between suspicion and restraint, trying to convince herself she was imagining things. But the day of revelation arrived without warning, shattering the fragile balance she had clung to. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the final piece fell into place. Catherine had returned to the office earlier than expected from a client meeting. She moved through the familiar glass corridors, heels clicking softly, her mind preoccupied with negotiations. Passing by Melissa's office, she noticed the blinds were drawn, unusual for a woman who thrived on transparency and openness. Something in Catherine's gut pulled her closer. The muffled sound of voices drifted from inside, their tones hushed but urgent. She paused, straining to listen. At first it was fragments, words about being careful, not letting her find out. Then Daniel's laugh, low and intimate, followed by Melissa's reply, tender in a way that had nothing to do with business. The conversation was short, but it was enough. Those weren't the tones of colleagues. They weren't even the tones of friends. They were the unmistakable sounds of lovers. Catherine felt her body go rigid. The hallway seemed to spin around her as if the walls themselves recoiled from what she had heard. She wanted to storm in, fling open the door, demand an explanation. But her instincts, the same instincts that had guided her rise in business, told her to wait, to see, to know beyond doubt. Moments later, the door opened. Daniel emerged, his tie loosened, Melissa following behind with hair slightly disheveled. They stopped short when they saw Catherine standing there. For the briefest second, the silence was deafening. Daniel's face drained of color, Melissa's eyes darted down. And in that instant, Catherine didn't need words. The truth stood naked before her. The moment seared itself into her memory. Daniel stammered something about going over proposals. Melissa tried to smile, but it cracked under Catherine's stare. No excuse could disguise the guilt etched into their bodies, into the air between them. Betrayal doesn't always require evidence on paper. Sometimes it lives in the way people look at each other when they are caught. Catherine felt a storm rise within her, but outwardly she stayed composed. She had learned long ago that power was never in the outburst, but in the silence that follows. Without a word, she brushed past them, her heels echoing through the corridor as she returned to her office. She closed the door behind her and sat down, hands trembling though her face remained calm. The flood of emotions came all at once. Devastation, rage, humiliation, numbness. Her husband, her closest friend. Two pillars of her life, conspiring in the shadows of the empire she had built. It wasn't just betrayal. It was desecration of trust, so sacred she hadn't thought it possible to fracture. She replayed every moment in her mind: the laughter, the secrecy, the canceled dinners, the whispers in the office. Each memory now fit into a cruel puzzle she could no longer unsee. Word began to ripple quietly through the office. Employees weren't deaf. They had noticed the drawn blinds, the awkward encounter, Catherine's abrupt return to her office. By the end of the day, whispers moved like wildfire, careful but relentless. No one dared ask Catherine directly, but the weight of knowledge hung in the air, thick enough to suffocate. In her solitude, Catherine stared at the photographs on her wall. The smiling trio at ribbon cuttings, Daniel's hand on her shoulder during an award ceremony, Melissa standing proudly beside them. The images mocked her now. What once symbolized unity now felt like stage theater, a lie captured in glossy frames. For the first time, Catherine allowed herself to grieve, not for the loss of a husband or a friend alone, but for the destruction of an entire life she had believed unshakable. She wept quietly, then wiped her tears with a steadiness that surprised even her. The grief was real, but beneath it, something else stirred. Resolve. She had spent her career mastering crises, and though this was deeply personal, she recognized it for what it was: a reckoning. She could either let it consume her, or she could rise above it. And rising above meant not only confronting Daniel and Melissa, but doing so on her own terms, in her own time. The truth was no longer hidden. The facade had cracked, and there was no rebuilding it. What remained was the choice of how Catherine would claim her power in the wake of betrayal. The moment of revelation had shattered her world, but it had also given her clarity. She would not remain silent forever. The storm that had been building was ready to break. Not in hushed hallways, but in the very heart of the empire they had all built together. Confrontations are rarely planned. They erupt when silence can no longer contain the weight of truth. For Catherine, that moment came just days after catching Daniel and Melissa in the hushed intimacy of a closed office. She had sat with the knowledge, turning it over like a shard of glass in her hands, deciding how best to wield it. To confront them privately would have been easier, less humiliating for all involved, but easier no longer mattered. What mattered was reclaiming her dignity and authority in a space where their betrayal had already begun to poison the atmosphere. It was a Friday morning. The office buzzed with the energy of a looming deadline, employees rushing to finalize reports before the weekend. Catherine called an all-staff meeting, summoning everyone into the large conference room with its floor-to-ceiling windows and polished oak table. These gatherings weren't unusual, but there was something in her tone, crisp, final, that left no room for excuses. Daniel arrived first, his usual confident swagger dimmed by a faint nervousness he tried to mask. Melissa followed close behind, clutching a notebook she didn't need. The employees filed in, whispering to one another, their eyes flicking between the three leaders at the front of the room. They could sense it. Something seismic was about to happen. Catherine stood at the head of the table, calm and poised. She let the silence settle before she spoke, her eyes sweeping the room, daring anyone to look away. "We've built this company on trust," she began, her voice steady, deliberate. "Trust between colleagues, trust with our clients, trust that what we present to the world is real, not illusion." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Melissa lowered her gaze to the polished surface of the table. Catherine continued, her words sharp as glass. "But what happens when that trust is broken? When betrayal seeps into the very foundation of what we've built?" The air thickened. Employees glanced at one another, tension knotting in their shoulders. Catherine turned her gaze on Daniel, then on Melissa. "I have always believed in leading with transparency, so I will not hide what many of you have already suspected. The man I share my home with and the woman I have called my partner in business have been having an affair." Gasps rippled across the room. A stunned silence followed, the kind that feels like a vacuum sucking every ounce of air from the space. Daniel's face flushed red, his mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came. Melissa's hands trembled, her notebook sliding to the floor with a soft thud that echoed louder than any denial. Catherine didn't flinch. You may wonder why I choose to say this here, in front of all of you. The answer is simple. The betrayal wasn't private. It happened here, in these halls, behind these closed doors. It was allowed to fester where our employees work, where our future is supposed to be forged. Silence would only make me complicit, and I refuse to be complicit. Daniel finally found his voice, stammering, "Catherine, please, this isn't the place." She cut him off with a calm wave of her hand. "It became the place the moment you and Melissa chose to desecrate it." Her tone never rose, but the authority in her words left no room for argument. Melissa tried to speak, her voice quivering. "Catherine, I never wanted to hurt you." But Catherine's stare silenced her. "You already did. Wanting is irrelevant. Choices were made. Repeatedly." The room remained frozen. Every employee caught between disbelief and awe. They had expected Catherine's strength, but not this raw, unflinching honesty. In that moment, she wasn't just their leader. She was a woman reclaiming her voice in the face of betrayal. Catherine straightened, her hands resting lightly on the table. "This company will move forward. It will not collapse because of lies. I will see to that. But let this be a reminder. What we build here must be built on integrity. Without it, success is nothing but smoke." She turned, leaving the room in silence, her heels striking the floor like a gavel, bringing the matter to a close. Daniel sat motionless, his jaw clenched. Melissa stared at the floor, her face pale. The employees remained seated long after Catherine had gone, the weight of what they had witnessed settling into their bones. For them, the confrontation was more than a scandal. It was a lesson. Power is not always in fury, but in clarity, and Catherine had delivered hers with surgical precision. Back in her office, Catherine closed the door behind her and let out a long, controlled breath. The confrontation had cost her, in heartbreak, in reputation, in the unraveling of a life she had once believed unshakable. But it had also restored something invaluable: her voice, her authority, her refusal to be diminished by the lies of those closest to her. The empire was wounded, yes, but Catherine had reminded everyone, including herself, that she was still its architect. The office did not return to normal after Catherine's public confrontation. In fact, normal ceased to exist. The atmosphere shifted overnight, and every corridor seemed to hum with the residue of what had transpired. Employees moved with a new kind of caution, their voices hushed, their eyes sharp. The drama that had unfolded in the conference room was impossible to erase, and though Catherine had walked out with her dignity intact, the ripple effects reached far beyond that single moment. For Daniel, the fallout was immediate and brutal. His credibility evaporated. Clients who once sought his charm now avoided his calls, wary of aligning themselves with a man whose scandal had become whispered industry gossip. Inside the company, employees who had once admired him now regarded him with thinly veiled contempt. The man who had embodied charisma now looked diminished, his once confident stride replaced by something halting, as if every eye in the building carried judgment. Melissa fared no better. Her reputation, built over years of networking and deal-making, crumbled under the weight of betrayal. Trust is fragile in business, and once broken, it rarely returns. Colleagues who once leaned on her advice now kept their distance. She still tried to carry herself with poise, but the sidelong glances and awkward silences made it clear. She was no longer seen as a partner, but as a liability. Even outside the company, whispers spread quickly. Industry peers spoke her name with pity at best, disdain at worst. The employees, caught in the middle, struggled to find their footing. They respected Catherine for her candor, but they also lived in the wake of uncertainty. Could the company survive such a rupture at its highest levels? Would investors lose faith? Would clients flee? For days, the office felt like a ship in the middle of a storm, every creak and groan reminding its crew that the hull might split at any moment. And yet, through it all, Catherine stood firm. She arrived each morning composed, her presence a stabilizing force. She met with department heads, reassured nervous investors, and addressed clients directly. Her message was clear. The company's integrity would not collapse because of personal betrayal. Her ability to separate the personal from the professional, at least in public, stunned many. What they didn't see were the nights she spent awake, staring at the ceiling, her chest heavy with grief. Behind the closed doors of her home, Catherine faced the unraveling of her marriage. Daniel attempted apologies, some desperate, others defensive. He alternated between regret and justification, insisting it just happened or that he never meant to hurt her. Each word only deepened the wound. Catherine listened but rarely replied. She had no energy left for his excuses. She had heard enough lies in the quiet of Melissa's office to last a lifetime. Melissa, too, reached out. There were emails filled with pleas for forgiveness, promises that the affair was a mistake, assurances that their friendship meant something. Catherine read them once, then closed her laptop without responding. Words were meaningless now. Melissa had chosen her path, and in doing so, had severed a bond that could not be repaired. The personal betrayal was devastating, but Catherine's greater concern was survival, her own and her company's. She knew perception was everything. If she faltered, if she appeared weak, the empire she had built would crumble under the weight of scandal. So she channeled her pain into purpose. She tightened operations, reassigned responsibilities, and quietly began restructuring leadership. Daniel and Melissa, once fixtures at the company's core, found themselves pushed to the margins, their influence stripped away piece by piece. Still, Catherine could not escape the emotional cost. Trust once broken does not heal cleanly. It leaves jagged scars, and those scars bled into every corner of her life. Friends she had once leaned on now tread carefully around her, unsure what to say. Family members whispered their support, but often with the pity she despised. She hated pity more than betrayal. Pity made her feel small, and Catherine refused to be small. Yet amidst the devastation, something unexpected emerged. Employees began to rally around her. They saw her strength not as invulnerability, but as resilience. They admired the way she faced humiliation and betrayal without allowing it to consume the company. Slowly, loyalty shifted. No longer toward the trio, but solely toward Catherine. She had become more than their leader. She had become their anchor. The affair had broken her marriage and shattered her friendship. It had scarred the company's image and left wounds that would take years to heal. But in its wake, Catherine discovered a truth she hadn't realized before. She could survive without Daniel. She could survive without Melissa. She didn't need them to be whole. The empire had been wounded, yes, but it was not destroyed, and neither was she. What lay ahead was uncertain. Lawsuits, financial restructuring, perhaps even the public fallout if the press caught wind. But Catherine had already endured the worst, the moment of betrayal, the humiliation, the collapse of trust. Everything after was just recovery, and recovery, she knew, was something she was built for. When betrayal strips everything familiar away, what remains is the raw question of survival. For Catherine, the confrontation and its aftermath had left her world fractured. Her marriage lay in ruins, her most trusted friendship burned to ash, and her company stood at a crossroads. Yet in that wreckage, she discovered a truth she had almost forgotten. She was the architect of her own life. If the empire had to be rebuilt, she would do it with her own hands. The weeks following the confrontation were difficult. Daniel moved out quietly, taking with him clothes and belongings, but leaving behind the silence of a house that once carried laughter. Melissa resigned from the company under the guise of personal reasons, though everyone knew the truth. Her departure was abrupt, and her absence was both a relief and a reminder. Catherine walked past Melissa's empty office. Every morning, its bare desk a symbol of trust destroyed. The company reeled at first, but Catherine refused to let it collapse. She convened leadership meetings daily, reassigned Melissa's client accounts, and made herself more visible than ever. Employees saw her determination and mirrored it. The loyalty that had once been split between the three leaders now coalesced entirely around her. The betrayal that could have toppled the company instead became the rallying point for its reinvention. Outside the office, Catherine began carving a new rhythm for herself. The evenings once filled with Daniel's chatter or Melissa's companionship became quieter, lonelier, but also clearer. She learned to sit with the silence without fearing it. She journaled late into the night, pouring out anger, sorrow, and eventually gratitude. Gratitude for the strength she hadn't known she possessed.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.